Well, hello guys, and hopefully you can hear me because as always in my neighborhood there's something going on. I think there's a chainsaw or a blower or something going on in the house behind me. But if I waited till it stopped, it might be Easter, and it's all about Halloween right now. So some of you may have watched the video a few days ago when I went on a shopping spree at Lowe's and I bought lots of these wonderful mums that were all in tight bud. And I think they're going to be spectacular once they all bloom out. And it's perfect timing because it's supposed to get up, I think, into the high 80s today, maybe the low 90s, but then it's supposed to cool off tonight. So this will be perfect timing for these mums. Now, this reminds me of an article that I wrote for HGTV magazine a number of years ago. And I was kind of trying to explain the difference between planting and plopping mums, because unlike other perennials, a lot of the time we use them as short-term display, and after that we may or may not plant them elsewhere or allow them to perennialize in the garden. And I call that the difference between planting or plopping. So this year I'm doing something that I call the half plop, and that's that I am going to partially kind of recess them into the ground so they will look as if they are flush with the top of the soil itself, but they're not going to be really planted, and I'll tell you in a minute why. So as you can see, I've got kind of my favorite design tip, a rhythm and repetition of something around a space. So the first blob of mums will start there in that curve, in the point of that curve. It will proceed around, and then there will be white that continues through the jack-o'-lanterns and ultimately ends up on the other side near the drive with a couple of more mums. Now, what is a half plop, you may ask? Well, a half plop is where I'm not going to really plant them, which would be the plop part. And as always, in all of my landscape beds underneath trees, I'm always encountering lots of roots. But the plop is basically when you just position a container mum in between pumpkins and things. That's what I call plopping them. You're just staging them. Now, they still have to be watered, and particularly in Oklahoma and particularly in this south-facing exposure, they'll need to be watered quite a bit. And that's true whether or not you just have them on your front porch or wherever. And the reason being, let me kind of digress from my half plop for a moment. The reason being, look at how pot bound those are. And this one isn't even that bad. Stuart, if you can get a close-up, you can see that there's just lots of dense roots there. The other ones that I pulled out were even more compacted, which means that the root ball is going to dry out very, very quickly. So to ensure the longevity of the mums, you want to make sure that you keep them really well hydrated wherever you have them positioned. So a lot of times, again, you could just tuck them somewhere like this in between some existing foliage, and you'll just have to keep them watered. Making sure, of course, if you can, that that plastic, kind of unsightly pot isn't exposed. But what I have discovered is if I do, I'm not going to really plant them. I'm not going to take them out of their plastic pot and put them all the way into the ground, because I don't want them here for the long term. I just want them here for the short term. So what I'm doing is just digging a hole that I can then kind of nestle the pot in. And this does a couple of things. Now, Stuart, if you don't mind, if you'll show everyone, this soil is really moist in here. Now, if it were extremely dried out, what I do is actually water the hole. So any kind of residual moisture that was in this hole would keep this plant, even in its pot, kind of cool, and its roots a little bit cooler, and would prevent, I think, its desiccation and drying out too quickly. So now what I'm going to do is I'm not going to plant this. I'm just going to plop it into that hole and then tuck all of this soil around it. Now the brilliant thing is, once these are finished blooming, it'll be, for me, hopefully right around mid-November. That is also the time that I'll be planting my tulips. So I can just take these out, and I've got a pre-existing hole to put a bunch of tulips in. Now, I've also made sure before I put it into place that I've really watered this mum extremely well, because as I said, this is southern exposure. And then on those infrequent occasions when I turn my sprinkler system on, these will get sprinkled. That said, again, I will constantly check them to make sure that they stay moist and that they stay well hydrated. Now, if there had been something already growing in that void or whatever, I could transplant it, I could do whatever I wanted to do. So that's kind of the half plop there. Let me show you again in this area. You'll notice that I cut back this rose very hard, and I want to do, when the light isn't quite so harsh, I want to do a whole segment on that. But right now it is thriving given all of this newfound air circulation. And I'm not going to go into the topic I want to discuss, but look how happy it is. It is really responding to that hard prune. So I've got another mum right here, and you can see right behind this boxwood that there's nothing growing. And this will carry that color all the way down to the street, so that when anyone is driving and they're coming from the west, they'll be able to immediately see this color. And again, as a reminder, these were all in white, you guys. The other thing that I love about this is that it just subtly recesses them. If they were sitting on top like this, they're not very stable, and in our high winds, they would easily blow over. This stabilizes them, and it also prevents a little bit of wind shear because their profile and their center of gravity is a little bit lower. This soil too is moist, though other areas up underneath the canopy of that tree are very dry. And when I planted the others, I really had to wet the soil down. And again, this one I hydrated very well. Now, in just a short amount of time, this will grow some more. This will fill in. It's got great air circulation. But I want to show you the same principle and how it applies to my topiaries. Now, this is one of those things that I'm almost embarrassed to tell you, because it is just so common sense, and why it took me so long to figure it out, I don't know. But I have these Eugenia topiaries that are positioned as vertical accent points in my front bed. You can see I've got 1, 2, 3 of them over here. That one's sitting a little wonky and it needs some help. Well, because they're in plastic pots, even though they look like they're concrete, they aren't heavy enough to really stand stable and not be subject to gusts of wind. And it's been very windy here recently. I want to keep them in pots that aren't quite so heavy because I have to move them in. Eugenia are not cold hardy, so I have to bring them in and take them into the greenhouse. So I finally realized, hello, Mr. Squirrel, that the half plop works on these too. So all I did was the same thing. I just dug a hole that I then just basically kind of plopped this plant into, instead of it staying on the surface of the garden soil. And now, despite our really windy days, this would be hard pressed to blow over. The other thing that does is it keeps them straight, because in the past, even if they didn't topple, it would nevertheless take them away from complete vertical, which always kind of bothers me. Just like that one over there that's sitting in a rather wonky way. So when you are positioning, whether it's mums or it is topiaries or potted plants or anything in the garden, you might want to consider that, digging something of a concave trench for them so that you can do the half plop.